He was a white Hollywood icon, worshipped by millions, the man who made the world believe in the power of getting back up. But one day a plain, wrinkled letter, sent from the heat-scarred streets of Burkina Faso, landed on his desk. Inside were just 17 handwritten words from a boy who once watched Rocky on a flickering black and white TV and who now leads a nation. That one sentence didn't ask for money. It didn't praise fame. It simply reminded him what it means to be seen when the world chooses to look away. And in that moment, Sylvester Stallone, the toughest man in American cinema, broke down in tears. This story will take you from red carpets to dirt roads, from fame to forgotten children, from privilege to purpose. Because behind this fictional tale lies a very real truth. We all want to matter. We all want to be remembered. We all want to be human. While inspired by fictional events, the emotions, injustices, and hopes explored here reflect real struggles faced by millions around the world. This is not just a story about a star, it's a story about all of us. So now we ask you, what would you do if just one sentence could change everything? The morning sun spilled gently through the wooden blinds of Sylvester Stallone's home office, casting narrow golden lines across the cluttered desk. Outside, birds chirped in the distance, and somewhere far off, a gardener trimmed a hedge. The kind of morning that felt quiet, ordinary. Inside, the room smelled of aged leather, strong espresso, and paper. The kind that's been read, folded, and carried for years. Movie posters lined the dark-paneled walls, most of them faded by time, framed tributes to a life spent on screens. Rocky, First Blood, Creed, relics of past triumphs staring down like old ghosts. At the center of it all sat Sylvester Stallone in a charcoal gray robe, hair slightly unkempt, fingers stained faintly with ink. In front of him was a massive pile of unopened fan mail, hundreds of envelopes, some crisp and new, others worn thin, like they'd crossed oceans. He sighed, took a sip of coffee, and nodded toward the pile. "Let's see what the world remembers," he muttered half to himself. His longtime assistant, Michael, early 30s, organized, smartly dressed in jeans and a black tee, leaned over the table with practiced hands. He began opening envelopes methodically. Fan drawings, autograph requests. Someone from Brazil had mailed him a handmade Rambo figurine. Another envelope contained only the phrase, "Yo, Adrian," written over and over in red marker. "Same old," Michael said, raising an eyebrow. Stallone chuckled softly but without joy. Same movie, same punchline, different handwriting. Just then, Michael paused. His hand hovered above a brown envelope. It looked old, really old. The kind of envelope you'd find pressed between the pages of a forgotten diary. It had no stamp, no logo, no return address. Just one line, handwritten in cursive. "To Mr. Sylvester Stallone, urgent." Michael turned it over, squinting. "Weird. This doesn't even look postmarked. You want me to toss it?" Stallone's eyes locked on it. Something about the handwriting. Elegant, unsure, like someone trying their best. It didn't match any fan mail he'd seen. "Wait," he said quietly. "Give me that one." Michael hesitated, then passed it over. Stallone didn't tear it open. He just stared at it for a moment. The way you might stare at a photograph of someone you haven't seen in 40 years. The room suddenly felt still, as if the letter had somehow silenced the air around them. "Everything okay?" Michael asked, sensing the change in energy. Stallone nodded but slowly. His fingers traced the curve of the handwriting before he carefully broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No fan art, no glitter, no request for an autograph. Just a letter, handwritten. The ink slightly smudged in one corner. The words neat but trembling. And at the bottom, signed in bold, Ibrahim Traore, President, Burkina Faso. Stallone blinked. Once. Twice. "Burkina Faso?" he whispered aloud, almost to himself. Michael leaned closer. "Where is that again?" "West Africa." But Stallone wasn't listening anymore. His eyes scanned the letter slowly, lips parting slightly as he read the opening lines. His hands began to tremble. And then, without warning, his shoulders dropped. He sat back, silent. A tear rolled down his cheek. Michael froze. In over a decade of working together, he had seen Stallone lift weights heavier than grown men, argue with studio heads, stand unshaken at funerals, but never cry. "Sly," he said softly, "what's in the letter?" Stallone didn't answer. He just held the paper, staring at it like it had just rewritten everything he knew about himself. Finally, he whispered, "I don't even know this man, but somehow he knows me." Stallone held the letter as if it were made of glass. The edges were slightly torn, the paper coarse, the kind of stationery not bought in bulk or printed from a hotel suite, but likely pulled from the last pages of a school notebook. For a long moment, he just stared at the ink. Then in a voice low and uncertain, he began to read aloud. "Dear Mr. Stallone, I am not writing to you as a politician. I write to you as a boy, a forgotten boy." His voice cracked ever so slightly, but he cleared his throat and continued. "My name is Ibrahim. I grew up in a small village outside Ouahigouya in Burkina Faso. When I was 7, our school had no electricity, no desks, no real windows. But we had one thing, an old black and white television that sometimes worked when the generator didn't give up." Stallone's eyes lifted from the page for a second, blinking into the sunlight that now cut across the floor. It felt unreal, as if someone had been watching his work through a different lens. Not Hollywood glitz, but raw survival. "One day our teacher played a movie on that TV. It was flickering. The sound was in a language I did not know. But I saw you, running, fighting, bleeding, falling, and getting back up. I didn't know the word for it then, but I felt it in my chest." Something cracked open. Michael sat quietly across the room, eyes fixed on Stallone as he read. The shift in the room was palpable, a stillness heavier than silence. "I was hungry, often. My father had been taken by soldiers. My mother walked 10 kilometers for rice. But that day, I saw a man on screen get knocked down and stand back up, again and again. You didn't speak my language, Mr. Stallone, but you spoke to my spirit. You taught me to fight, not with fists, but with hope." Stallone's voice faltered. His fingers tightened around the page, knuckles whitening. He lowered the letter slightly, resting it on his lap, and let the words hang in the air. "Jesus," he whispered. "This kid was fighting for his life, and I was pretending to box on a soundstage." Michael leaned forward. "Do you want me to stop recording?" Stallone didn't answer. He picked the letter back up. "Years later, I became a soldier, not by choice, but by circumstance. And one night, in the mud and dark, I remembered Rocky. I got up when I wanted to stay down. I carried others who couldn't walk, not because I was fearless, but because I had seen a man keep going, even after the bell." His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Today, I am no longer that boy. I am the president of Burkina Faso, and I am standing because once upon a time, Rocky stood too." Stallone stopped reading. He didn't cry loudly or dramatically. No sobbing, just a silent tremble in his chin and a blink that took too long. The kind of cry that comes when the heart realizes it had forgotten something vital. Something buried beneath applause and bright lights. "I don't even know this man," Stallone said quietly. "But somehow, he knows me." Michael remained silent. There was nothing to say. The letter, still unfinished, trembled in Stallone's hands. But it wasn't just paper anymore. It felt heavier, like memory, like responsibility. He stood up slowly, walked to the window, and looked out at the morning that now felt completely changed. Same sunlight, same sky. But inside him, something had shifted. Behind him, Michael whispered, "What are you thinking?" Stallone didn't turn around. He just said, "I thought I was done telling stories, but maybe I've just been cast in the most important one." And with that, he turned back toward the desk, toward the letter, toward something unknown, something waiting. Michael was pacing now, phone already unlocked, ready to verify the letter. "Let me call the embassy or something. There has to be a way to check if this is real," he said, half to himself, half to Stallone. His voice was practical, sharp with concern. "Anyone can say they're a president. It could be a hoax, PR scam, or worse. But Stallone didn't respond. He stood by the window, one hand on the sill, the other still gripping the letter. His eyes weren't focused on the garden outside. They were somewhere else entirely. Somewhere far from Los Angeles. Somewhere dusty, quiet, forgotten by headlines. Michael tried again, softer this time. Sly, let's just be smart about this. Let me make some calls. Confirm the sender. We don't even know if this guy's legit. Stallone turned slowly, not angry, not dramatic, just calm, steady. His voice, when it came, was quieter than usual, but absolute. No, Michael blinked. No? No calls. No press. No publicist. No social posts. Not yet. He walked over to his desk, placed the letter back into its envelope, and smoothed it out with both palms, like a sacred object being tucked away for safekeeping. This wasn't written to a celebrity, he said. This was written to a man. Michael watched him carefully. You're serious? Stallone nodded. There was a long pause, and then, without ceremony, he said it. Book me a flight. Private, no reporters, no trail. To where? Stallone met his eyes. Burkina Faso. Michael opened his mouth, then closed it. This wasn't a movie. This wasn't a promo tour. This wasn't even nostalgia. This was something else. Something bigger. Something raw. Within the hour, his team was moving. Quietly, precisely. The logistics were pulled with urgency, but not chaos. Stallone had done covert filming before. He knew how to vanish when he needed to. But this time, the goal wasn't secrecy for privacy's sake. It was reverence. He didn't want the noise of fame to follow him. Not here, not for this. That evening, the sun began its slow descent over the Pacific, turning the sky to streaks of gold and rust. From the balcony of his home, Stallone stood alone, the envelope now resting in his hand like a compass. His silhouette cut against the light, motionless. Not as a star, not as a brand, but as a man quietly questioning the purpose of his own legacy. And as the last light dipped beneath the horizon, he whispered, not to himself, but to something greater, something distant yet calling, I'm coming. The jet descended through a ceiling of pale sand haze clouds and touched the runway with a rumble that felt different, looser, raw, as if the earth itself were reminding the wheels they were far from Bel Air marble. Through the oval window, Sylvester Stallone saw a landscape the color of burnt copper, stretching toward a wavering horizon. No gleaming terminal, no competing logos, only a squat concrete building bleached by decades of sun and Saharan dust. A single windsock flapped like a tattered pennant of welcome. When the cabin door opened, heat rushed in, thick, immediate, spiced with diesel and distant charcoal. Stallone stepped onto the metal stairs and paused, blinking against the glare. Dry wind scraped across the tarmac, carrying flecks of red grit that clicked softly against his sunglasses. In the perimeter shadows, he noticed movement, a thin line of children behind a chain-link fence. Barefoot, eyes wide, some waving shyly, others merely staring with the solemn curiosity of those accustomed to watching planes they will never board. There were no reporters, no flashbulbs, no motorcade. Instead, two aging dark green SUVs waited side by side, idling unevenly. Their paint was dull, wheel wells dust-caked, but the tires looked stubborn and serviceable. On the windshield of the first vehicle, someone had taped a postcard-sized flag of Burkina Faso, red over green bisected by a yellow star. It fluttered inside the glass, more handmade than ceremonial, yet somehow more dignified than any satin banner a studio could have provided. At the bottom of the stairs, a man in a light gray short-sleeved suit greeted him. No entourage, just a clipboard, a shy smile, and the polite fatigue of an official used to making miracles with limited fuel. Mr. Stallone, he said, accent gently melodic, welcome. My name is Adama. The president regrets he cannot meet you here. He will see you shortly in Ouagadougou. Please, let us take you somewhere first. Stallone nodded. The letter from Ibrahim Traore folded neatly inside his jacket like a secret blueprint. Michael followed with their minimal luggage, one duffel each, a camera, a water bottle. They climbed into the rear seat. The interior smelled of sun-baked vinyl and lemon oil someone had rubbed into the dashboard in a respectful, if losing, battle against age. As the convoy rolled forward, the rhythm of the road announced itself through the shocks. Thud creak, thud creak, thud creak. Outside, the airport perimeter dissolved into open scrub and low ochre buildings. Motorbikes buzzed past in clouds of dust. Women in bright patterned wrappers balanced baskets of mangoes and cassava on their heads. A goat darted between stalled trucks like a rogue extra ignoring stage direction. Children from the fence now chased the SUVs for a few jubilant strides, laughing before peeling away to wave at the next unlikely wonder. Inside the car, Michael adjusted to the jostle and leaned closer to Stallone. "Still no press," he whispered, half relieved, half anxious. Stallone kept his gaze fixed out the window, absorbing every detail: the cracks in the asphalt, the electricity lines sagging low, the way heat painted a mirage shimmer above the road. Nothing about this felt like a promotional tour. It felt like stepping into a film whose script he hadn't read, yet somehow carried in his blood. 10 minutes later, they passed a weather-worn sign: "Bienvenue à Ouagadougou," "Welcome to the land of upright people." The phrase struck him. Upright people. People who stand. He thought of the letter's line. "I am standing because Rocky stood." A vibration, both literal from the road and figurative from memory, traveled up through the seat into his chest. Adama glanced back. "We are almost at the first stop," he said. "It is not far. You may find it humble." There was no apology in his tone, only quiet pride. Stallone offered a faint smile. "Humble has a way of teaching." They turned onto a narrower lane, where the dust deepened and eucalyptus trees leaned overhead like silent spectators. Ahead, the roofline of a small, sun-bleached compound emerged, a scatter of low buildings, corrugated tin, walls painted with half-faded murals of books, doves, and boxing gloves. A hand-painted board creaked on rusty hinges. École d'Espoir, School of Hope. The SUV stopped. Engines clicked into silence. The heat rushed back in, thicker now, but Stallone barely felt it. He stepped out, boots pressing into powdery soil, and for an instant everything went still. The breeze, the distant traffic hum, even the curious children who had begun to gather at the gate. He looked at the chipped doorway ahead and at the small flag on the windshield behind him, then at the letter he could almost feel pulsing through his jacket. Los Angeles was 11 time zones away, yet never had a place felt so immediate, so present. He exhaled once, slow, as if shedding the last thin layer of the world he knew, and followed Adama toward the school, dust swirling lightly around every step like a veil lifting from a long-guarded story. Adama pushed open the rusted gate with a creak that echoed strangely in the still air. Inside the courtyard, a cluster of low, sun-scorched buildings stood like worn-out sentinels. Their clay walls were cracked in thin, snaking lines, the kind of damage not caused by neglect, but by time and heat in the quiet patience of survival. Chickens wandered under benches. A torn football lay deflated near the edge of a sandbox, more dust than sand. The air was dry and heavy, carrying the scent of sun on metal and old chalk. Stallone stepped in slowly, eyes scanning the place with a quiet reverence. He had walked onto countless film sets in his life, million-dollar replicas of war zones, alleys, and boxing gyms. But never had he entered a space so unpolished, yet so charged with meaning. This was no set. There were no cameras. And yet, the moment felt cinematic, like the frame had narrowed and the volume of the world turned low. "This is it," Adama said softly. "This was where President Traore saw the film, over 20 years ago." They moved toward one of the classrooms. It had no door. The doorway was just an open rectangle, edges chipped, the paint long since faded to a dull echo of what might have once been blue. Inside, the room was dim, lit only by daylight slanting through a crack in the ceiling and a few dusty windows without glass. Stallone entered slowly. The air was thick with the scent of dust, old paper, and sun-baked walls. The floor was bare earth, smoothed by countless small feet. The walls were scrawled with chalk equations and peeling posters, one of a bird flying free, another of a child holding a book above his head as if it were a shield. At the far end of the room stood a rusty old film projector, the kind that hadn't been manufactured in decades. Its wheels were locked, the lens cracked, but it still stood proud, as though it had one final reel it wasn't ready to give up on. In front of it, a white cloth screen, no bigger than a bedsheet, hung unevenly on the back wall. It fluttered slightly in the faint breeze, ghost-like. For a long moment, Stallone said nothing. He stepped forward and slowly sat down on the dirt floor. He crossed his legs just as a child might and stared at the cloth screen. Around him, the silence deepened. The wind fell away. His mind reached backward. He imagined it. A much younger Ibrahim, skinny knees, bare feet, dirt on his cheek, sitting exactly where he now sat, the hum of the generator stuttering, the screen flickering, black and white images dancing through the dust. And there he was, Rocky Balboa, running up the steps, face bruised, heart full, rising, not in English, not in words, but in pure, undeniable motion. Stallone felt the edges of his eyes sting. To him, it had always been a scene about grit, about resilience. But now he saw it differently. Through the eyes of a child in a war-touched country, that scene hadn't been about victory. It had been about survival. It had been a promise. That falling didn't mean the end. That standing up meant everything. Adam's voice broke gently into the silence. They used to crowd in here, 30 children at a time. No shoes, no chairs. But when the film played, no one moved. Not even the heat could distract them. Stallone stood slowly, brushing the dust from his hands. His gaze lingered on the white cloth. "It's strange," he said, voice quiet. "We spent millions filming those scenes, building fake streets, choreographing every punch. But this screen, this one might have mattered more than all of it." He looked back at Adama, then at the room. "There was no popcorn," he said. "No marketing, just a boy and a flickering dream." Adama nodded. "And that dream grew into something bigger than he ever imagined." Stallone stepped to the back of the room, near the projector. He touched it lightly, reverently. The metal was warm from the sun, rough beneath his fingers. He imagined the film rolling again, the sweat, the training, the music building. A barefoot child, clutching his knees, eyes wide with something beyond wonder. Recognition. Suddenly, a sound stirred behind him. Soft footsteps. He turned to see a little boy, barefoot, maybe 6, peeking through the doorway. He clutched a stick like a toy sword and stared up at Stallone with quiet awe. Then, in a whisper, he asked, "Setua, Rocky?" Stallone crouched, meeting the child's gaze. He placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder and smiled. "No," he said softly, "but I came because of you." Outside, the trees swayed slightly. Inside, history and hope sat face to face, one made of film, the other of flesh, and the line between them disappeared. The boy stood just beyond the threshold, small shoulders silhouetted by sunlight, dust circling around his ankles like golden mist. He couldn't have been older than 6. His shirt was too big, sleeves swallowing his elbows, and his shorts were patched in 3 places, but his posture was upright, curious, brave. In his hand, he held a stick no longer than his arm, gripped not like a weapon, but like a talisman. His eyes, wide, dark, and impossibly steady, were fixed on Stallone. They stared at each other in silence, one man and one child, as if time had collapsed in that cracked, doorless classroom. Then the boy took a cautious step forward. Another. He pointed the stick gently, not in threat, but in wonder. His voice came out barely above a whisper, shaded with accent and awe. "Setua, Rocky?" The question didn't surprise Stallone. Not exactly. He had been mistaken for Rocky more times than he could count, even in countries where people barely spoke English. But something in the way this boy asked it was different. There was no fandom in it, no request for autograph or selfie, just searching, as though he wasn't identifying a character, but a memory, a story that had lived in his imagination for so long, he now needed to confirm it had truly come from somewhere real. Stallone lowered himself to one knee, slowly, so he could be at eye level with the boy. The movement sent a small puff of dust into the air. He looked at the boy not with amusement, not with the detached smile of a celebrity, but with a quiet tenderness that surprised even himself. He reached out, gently rested a hand on the boy's tiny shoulder, and smiled. "No," he said softly, "but I came because of you." The boy didn't move. Then slowly his lips parted into a small smile. Just a flicker, like sunlight slipping between clouds. He nodded once, then turned and darted off through the doorway, his stick trailing behind him like a banner. The sound of his bare feet tapping the packed earth faded into the courtyard. Stallone remained kneeling for a few seconds longer, the dust still swirling. He stared at the doorway, heart heavy in his chest. Not with sorrow, but with something he couldn't name. Not pride, not nostalgia. Something deeper. For decades he had stood in boxing rings that weren't real, bleeding under makeup, delivering lines written by others. He had inspired millions, yes, but always as a character, a myth wrapped in sweat and orchestral music. For the first time, in that little room of peeling paint and cracked clay, he understood something simple and shattering. He wasn't here as Rocky. He wasn't here as a movie star. He was here as a mirror. He was here as a reminder that sometimes the stories we tell, when they're honest, when they're human, don't just entertain, they echo. They plant seeds in distant soil, take root in places we may never see, and sometimes they grow into little boys with sticks in their hands and hope in their eyes. Stallone stood up slowly, brushing the dust from his knee, and for the first time in a very, very long time, he didn't feel like he was acting. He felt real. The old baobab tree stood at the edge of the compound like a guardian from another time. Its thick, gnarled trunk was wide enough to shade a small house, its branches twisted into the sky like the open hands of a wise elder. Beneath it, two simple wooden chairs and a narrow table had been placed on the packed earth. No flags, no podium, no polished brass, just the tree, the dust, and the soft hush of leaves rustling in the dry afternoon wind. Stallone arrived with Adama in silence. He wore a plain shirt, sleeves rolled up, dust on his boots. No security detail, no sunglasses, just him, and the letter still tucked into the breast pocket of his shirt, now creased, warmed by the press of his heart. Sitting alone at the table was President Ibrahim Traore. He rose slowly as Stallone approached, a tall, lean man with a presence both calm and commanding. His eyes were sharp but kind, the eyes of someone who had known war and chosen peace. He wore a faded white tunic and simple sandals, and for a moment he looked less like a head of state and more like a teacher waiting for his student to arrive. They shook hands with no flourish, no cameras clicked, no press watched. It was a meeting that felt more like a memory returning to itself. "Mr. Stallone," Traore said warmly, his voice deep, grounded, "you are not what I expected." Stallone smiled faintly. "Neither are you." They sat, the silence between them unforced. The kind of silence that could only exist between two men who had carried weight, who knew what it meant to rise with bruised ribs and a quiet will. For a while they didn't speak. The only sound was the hum of cicadas, the faint laughter of children playing somewhere in the distance. Then Traore leaned forward, resting his hands on the table, fingers laced. "I watched Rocky when I had nothing," he said simply. "No food, no light, no hope." Stallone nodded slowly, looking down at his hands. "I made Rocky when I had nothing too." The admission wasn't dramatic. It wasn't delivered with pride. Just a fact, shared across continents and decades. One man's survival tool became another man's lifeline. What Stallone had once written in a small apartment with overdue rent had somehow crossed oceans and language and time and found its way to a barefoot boy in the middle of West Africa. "I remember thinking," Traore continued, "if that man can stand back up after falling so many times, maybe I can too." Stallone looked up. "You didn't just stand up. You changed your whole country." Traore smiled, but his eyes stayed serious. "You showed me the way. I only walked it." There was another pause. Not awkward, just full. Then Traore did something unexpected. He reached behind his chair and pulled out a third wooden stool. He placed it between them, right at the edge of the table. Stallone raised an eyebrow. For someone else, Traore nodded. For every child who ever felt invisible, who sat alone in the dark, wondering if they mattered. This chair is for them. Stallone's eyes softened. They sat like that for a moment, two men and an empty chair. And in that stillness, the weight of everything unspoken settled between them. Pain, struggle, memory, survival. Not as tragedy, but as testament. Traore broke the silence once more, voice low. When you speak through stories, you never know who's listening. Stallone looked toward the empty chair, his voice barely audible. And when they answer back, it changes you. The wind shifted slightly. A dry leaf fell between them and danced away in the dirt. The late afternoon sun poured through the branches in angled shafts, turning the dust gold. There were no contracts signed, no deals made, but something unspoken passed between them. A kind of vow, built not from politics or publicity, but from the recognition of shared humanity. Traore stood. Would you like to see where the next part of the story begins? Stallone rose too. I think I already have. And beneath the baobab tree, where nothing was scripted and everything was real, the man who once played a fighter met the boy who had become a leader. And the world for a moment felt whole. The third chair sat between them, light and unvarnished, its legs slightly uneven in the dirt. It was nothing more than a simple wooden stool, but the way President Traore placed it, gently, deliberately, like a sacred gesture, transformed it into something else, a symbol, an offering. For the children who were never seen, he said softly, as the wind stirred dust around its legs. Stallone stared at it. At first he didn't speak. There was a tension in his jaw, like he was holding back something. Not emotion exactly, but memory. It was the kind of silence born not from confusion, but recognition, as if that empty chair had just echoed a truth he hadn't admitted to himself in years. Traore reached down into a simple satchel resting at the foot of his stool. From it, he pulled a thick envelope, hand-sealed with string, bulging at the seams. He placed it carefully on the table between them, beside the third chair, and untied the knot. These came after the first letter, he said, from children at the school, from orphanages, from the street. Some knew who you were. Some only knew what your story made them feel. He opened the envelope and pulled out the first letter, a small sheet of paper folded into quarters, its edges frayed. He handed it to Stallone. Stallone unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was large and clumsy, but heartfelt. Dear Rocky, I run every morning before school. When I run, I feel like I am flying. I imagine I am chasing something better. He blinked, then reached for the next one. I want to be strong like you. Not strong with muscles, but strong in my heart. I want to protect my sister. The third was drawn on lined notebook paper, with the corner torn and a smudge of red dirt across one edge. President Traore said you are his brother. That means you are our uncle. Will you visit us someday? His hands trembled slightly as he turned to another, a folded scrap of packaging paper. On it, written in a barely legible scrawl, when I feel afraid, I remember Rocky got up. Stallone didn't speak. He didn't have to. His fingers lingered on that sentence like it carried weight too heavy to name. He stared down at the page, his shoulders stiff, lips pressed together. A single tear slid down one cheek and disappeared into the lines of his weathered face. Traore didn't interrupt. Instead, he placed a crayon drawing onto the table, a child's rendering of a boxer with wings instead of gloves. Above the figure, written in yellow, Our Protector. Stallone stared at the image for a long time. Then finally he spoke. I thought I was the hero, he said quietly, but I think maybe I was just the messenger. He looked at Traore, voice barely holding steady. These kids, they're the ones who keep getting up, with nothing, no gloves, no crowd, just their bare hands and hope. He pressed a hand to his chest like he was trying to calm something beneath his ribs. I've played so many men in pain, he whispered, but none of it compares to what's in these letters. Traore nodded, solemn. This is why the third chair matters, because for so long these children sat outside the frame. No spotlight, no audience, and yet they never stopped writing their own stories. Stallone's eyes drifted back to the chair. That empty seat now felt full, not with a person, but with the weight of 1,000,000 untold lives, of barefoot children running before sunrise, of whispered dreams scrawled on packaging paper, of broken pencils writing down words like brave, uncle, protector. He looked up at the sky, not to avoid the moment, but to honor it. The sun had begun to dip, casting long shadows from the baobab's limbs across the ground like fingers stretching to hold them all. "Do you think they'll ever know," Stallone said, "what they've done to me?" Traore smiled, but there was sadness in it. "Maybe not, but sometimes we don't tell stories to be known. We tell them to make sure someone else knows they're not alone." And as the wind passed through the leaves and the light deepened into amber, the two men, a fighter from the screen and a fighter from the soil, sat with an empty chair between them. And it had never felt more full. The sun had begun its slow descent beyond the low rooftops, casting long amber shadows across the courtyard. The day was softening, and with it, the intensity of the moment between Stallone and Traore settled into a still, reverent silence. The third chair remained between them, quiet and sacred. Its presence felt more deeply with every passing minute. Then from behind the baobab, a soft shuffle of footsteps. A girl, maybe 9 years old, emerged hesitantly from the shade. She wore a faded yellow dress with one shoulder slightly torn. Her hair was braided unevenly, as if done in a hurry, and in her hand she held something small, wrapped in a cloth the color of old clay. She approached slowly, glancing at Traore first for permission. He nodded once. She stepped forward. Without a word, she looked up at Stallone, her gaze direct but not demanding. There was something ancient in her eyes. Not from age, but from having seen too much too soon. Then with both hands she offered him the bundle. Stallone took it gently, unfolding the fabric. Inside was a simple bracelet made of carved wood. The beads were irregular, rough around the edges, and strung on what looked like a repurposed shoelace. But it was clearly made with care. Every bead sanded by hand, every cut purposeful. Traore spoke softly. "She carved it herself. That's all she had." Stallone looked at the bracelet for a long time. He turned it over slowly in his palms, the texture of each bead whispering its own story. The weight of it wasn't much, but the meaning was crushing. His throat tightened. He tried to speak, but the words didn't come. So instead, he slipped the bracelet onto his wrist, where it sat loosely, warm from her hands. Then he bent down slightly, locking eyes with the girl. "Thank you," he whispered. She nodded once, then turned and quietly walked away, her bare feet brushing the dust, leaving only the echo of her gesture behind. Stallone remained still. The bracelet felt heavier than his championship belts, more valuable than any golden statue he had ever held. In all his years, the lights, the fame, the awards, no one had ever given him something like this. Not because they wanted something, not because of who he was, but because of what he had unknowingly given. For the first time in his life, he felt small, not in shame, but in humility, as though, in the presence of a child with nothing to give but a handmade bracelet, he had come face to face with a kind of wealth he would never be able to repay. Traore spoke again, gently. "She said if you wore it, maybe the others would believe they mattered too." Stallone nodded slowly, staring at the bracelet now glowing in the low sun. He didn't feel like a legend anymore. He felt like a student, and for the first time in decades, he realized that some of the greatest roles in life aren't scripted. They're given, quietly, by those the world forgets. The following afternoon, a battered white pickup arrived to ferry Stallone, Michael, and a single social worker escort down a road so narrow the acacia branches slapped softly against the doors. There were no traffic lights here, no painted lanes, only dusty ruts that disappeared into stretches of thorn scrub and scattered brick shells of abandoned homes. Eventually, the truck pulled up to a low compound whose walls were mottled with sun-faded murals, a stenciled dove, a child reading beneath a crescent moon, a boxer lifting another from the ground. Above a hand-carved doorway, a plank of wood bore the words Maison de Résilience in uneven blue paint. Inside the courtyard, a hush settled the moment Stallone stepped from the truck. Dozens of children paused mid-game, marbles frozen in the dirt, a half-inflated ball rolling to a stop. They regarded him not with the frenzy that trails celebrities, but with a wary, almost ceremonial curiosity, as if trying to decide whether the giant from the flickering sheet could breathe the same air they did. Nearby, laundry fluttered on a rope, shirts the size of tea towels, shoes drying upside down on sticks driven into the ground. A goat tugged at a stalk of maize. There was life here, but it felt paper-thin, as if one harsh wind could scatter it to the fields. Sister Aminata, the caretaker, greeted them, a woman whose posture spoke of decades spent lifting children rather than weights. She offered a soft smile, gesturing Stallone toward a long veranda shaded by corrugated tin. "The children want to share their stories," she said quietly. "Only if you wish to listen." Stallone nodded, the wooden bracelet clinking gently against his wrist. They entered a cool interior room where the walls were painted sky blue, chipped in patches that revealed earlier, duller coats. Broken toys lined one shelf like casualties of too much play. A headless doll, a plastic truck with no wheels, a football sewn from rags. Yet someone had arranged them with care, as if even broken things deserved order. The children filed in, sitting cross-legged on woven mats. They ranged in age from toddlers with wide, searching eyes to teenagers whose gazes held something older than their years. Sister Aminata rested a reassuring hand on the shoulder of a thin boy with close-cropped hair and a t-shirt that read, "Shine Bright" in peeling glitter letters. "This is Jonah," she said. Jonah looked at Stallone, then at the floor, then back again as if measuring the trust in the room. Finally he spoke, his voice soft, accented but steady. "I hid for 2 days," Jonah said. "When the men came to our village, they took everything. I ran into the bush. I was thirsty and the nights were cold. I thought I would die." He paused, swallowing. "But I remembered a film the older boys once played on a phone. A man kept falling, but he stood up again." His eyes flicked to Stallone, not quite believing the connection was real. "I told myself, if he can stand, so can I." Jonah exhaled, a tiny shudder in his shoulders. "So I walked until the soldiers found me. Soldiers who were good. They brought me here." The room was silent except for the buzz of a lone fly circling the ceiling bulb. Stallone felt every muscle in his throat tighten. He couldn't decide whether to look away or hold the boy's gaze. He chose the latter, and after a long breath, he knelt so they were eye level. "You stood up," Stallone said quietly. "Longer than any reel of film, longer than any crowd would ever watch. And you're still standing." Jonah's lips pressed together, not quite a smile, but something softer, an acknowledgement that the worst part of his story had been heard and somehow honored. One by one, other children spoke. A girl who lost her parents during a border clash, a pair of twins who had walked miles holding hands until they reached a checkpoint, a little boy who had no words, only a drawing he thrust into Stallone's hands, a house with a roof intact and smoke curling cheerfully from a chimney. Every story shared felt like another thread sewn into an invisible tapestry that stretched from this fragile courtyard back to a boxing ring in Philadelphia and beyond. Stallone listened, not as an actor collecting material, but as a student of resilience, each account a lesson in the anatomy of hope. When the sun angled lower, Sister Aminata rang a small brass bell for supper. The children rose, some offering shy waves, others slipping forward to touch Stallone's calloused hand, as if to confirm he was flesh. As they dispersed, Jonah lingered, then reached into his pocket and offered Stallone a pebble, smooth and dark. "For strength," he said. Stallone closed his fingers around it, feeling its coolness anchor him to the ground. Outside, dusk bled violet over the compound. The Maison de Resilience had no marble floors, no locked gates, no glossy brochures. But within its walls, Stallone had witnessed a courage unpolished by training montages or cheers. And as the first evening star appeared over the horizon, he realized the children had given him more than stories. They'd handed him a responsibility he could neither script nor ignore. The sun had dipped low by the time Stallone stepped back into the courtyard of Maison de Resilience. The laughter of children had returned like a soft wind after a long stillness, echoing between cracked walls and shaded corners. Evening light spilled through the woven slats of the outer fence, drawing golden lines on the dusty ground. It had been a long day, heavy with stories and silences, but there was a warmth now. Not comfort exactly, but connection. Traore had joined him by then, quiet as ever, observing from a few paces away, arms crossed, as if watching two worlds slowly learn to recognize each other. Stallone had retreated to the wooden bench by the old water drum, where children now played hopscotch with a bottle cap and a line of chalk. His eyes followed them gently, lost in thought, until he noticed a girl standing apart from the others. She couldn't have been more than 8. Her dress, once white, had turned a dusty beige. Her braids were tied with bits of yarn, red on the left, blue on the right. In her hands, she held a folded piece of paper, pinched tightly like it might slip away if she loosened her grip. She didn't speak, just inched closer, watching him the way a child watches a wild animal, with curiosity, awe, and a hint of fear. Stallone offered a small smile and nodded once. That was enough. She stepped forward, still silent, and extended the paper toward him with both hands. He took it gently. The paper was soft from being handled too much. The edges curled. As he unfolded it, his breath caught. It was a drawing, crayon on notebook paper, colorful and chaotic, the kind only children could make. The figure at the center was clearly meant to be him, a broad man with thick arms and boxing gloves, but instead of standing in a ring, he floated above the ground. Behind him were enormous golden wings, uneven, like a bird still learning to fly. Above his head was a simple line, scrawled in blocky French, Notre Protecteur. Stallone stared. He tried to speak, but something in his throat stopped him. He looked down at the girl, who was watching him without blinking. He knelt slowly to her level and let the paper fall into his lap, his eyes beginning to sting. Then, without thinking, he opened his arms. The girl hesitated out just a second, then stepped forward and folded herself into the space he offered. He held her gently, but fully, his face tucked near her shoulder. A breath escaped him that wasn't quite a sob, but something just as raw, something old and soft and cracked open. When he finally pulled back, his voice came low and hoarse. "I think," he said, "you're the real protector." The girl didn't say anything. She only smiled, small and proud, then turned and ran off, the tails of yarn in her hair fluttering behind her like twin comets. Stallone sat there for a moment longer, still clutching the drawing, still holding the warmth of her tiny frame in his arms. The weight of it all began to settle in. This wasn't just admiration. This was a transference, a passing of strength from screen to soul, from fiction to flesh. Traore stepped forward then, placing a quiet hand on Stallone's shoulder. "Your story," he said, "reached places even you never imagined." Stallone looked up at him. "I always hoped it would mean something. But this," he held up the drawing with the wings, "this isn't what I thought I was sending out into the world." Traore nodded, eyes scanning the horizon. "Stories never land where we expect. They ride the wind. And sometimes, when they fall in the right place, they grow wings of their own." Stallone chuckled, a soft, broken sound. "Funny. I spent half my life pretending to be strong, and today an 8-year-old girl made me feel more seen than anyone ever has." Traore's voice was barely above a whisper. "Because here, you're not Rocky. You're not Stallone. You're hope, and hope is sacred." The last light of day stretched long shadows across the courtyard. Stallone folded the drawing carefully, tucking it into his pocket like a talisman. And as children sang softly in the distance, their voices rising like smoke in the dusk, he sat still and silent, watching the sky darken. Not as an actor, not as a legend, but as a man finally beginning to understand what it meant to be believed in by those who had nothing, and still gave everything. That night, the guest house was quiet. The air was thick with heat, even after sundown, and the ceiling fan turned in slow, uneven rotations, creaking slightly with every pass. Outside the window, the world was silent. No traffic, no nightlife, only the occasional bark of a stray dog, and the soft, rhythmic chirping of insects in the brush. Inside, Sylvester Stallone lay awake in a narrow bed with a mosquito net draped like a canopy over him, the bracelet still on his wrist, the child's drawing with wings resting on the nightstand like a watchful guardian. Sleep didn't come. Not out of restlessness or discomfort, but because something deeper was stirring, something he hadn't felt in years. Not inspiration, not nostalgia, but a kind of disquiet that demanded attention. Not the noise of ego, but the whisper of truth. He reached for the lamp, switched it on, and the room lit with a soft amber glow. He sat up slowly, reached for the leather-bound notebook he kept in his travel bag, mostly used for scribbling story ideas or bits of dialogue he'd forget by morning. But this time, there was no movie, no plot, no character to hide behind, just him. A man far from home, sitting in a place he couldn't have found on a map a month ago, staring at a blank page with hands that had once held scripts and contracts, now holding something heavier, understanding. He put pen to paper and began to write. Not for the public, not for a camera, for himself. Tonight I'm not writing as Rocky or Rambo or any of the other names people have shouted at me for 4 decades. I'm writing as Sly, the kid who once dreamed from a cramped apartment with nothing but hunger and a story in his bones. His handwriting was uneven, slanted. The page absorbed the words like earth drinks rain. I came here thinking I was famous, but now I'm learning what it means to be human. Not the kind of human that gets followed or remembered, the kind that listens, the kind that holds a child's drawing and feels it burn like truth. He paused, took a breath, then kept going. In LA, they cheer for box office numbers. Here, they cheer when a child survives another day. There's no red carpet, no slow motion montage, but every step these kids take is a fight. Every smile is a victory. His throat tightened, but he kept writing. What they've given me here, it's not praise, it's not admiration. It's purpose. And purpose, that's the only fire that doesn't burn out. He finished the letter not with a closing line, but with a single word underlined. Stay. Then he closed the notebook and set it gently beside the drawing. He lay back down, eyes open, staring through the netting, past the ceiling, into the darkness beyond. For the first time in years, he didn't need applause to feel alive. He didn't need cameras or contracts or characters. What he needed, what he had found, was a reason. And as the night wrapped around him like a silent prayer, the fire inside him didn't roar. It glowed. The sun was already high by the time the children began to gather. The schoolyard had been swept clean, its dusty earth carefully smoothed by dozens of small hands and bare feet. No decorations, no banners, just a few plastic chairs arranged in a semicircle, facing a wooden platform built from old planks and propped up with bricks. It wasn't much, uneven, weathered, but it stood firm, like everything else that had survived here. Stallone stood at the edge of the yard, watching them come. One by one, then in small clusters. Some wore school uniforms with frayed collars. Others came in t-shirts faded from too many washings. Some clutched notebooks or handmade signs. A few carried nothing at all but their names and their stories. They lined the circle quietly, with the kind of reverence that made the space feel holy. Not because of who was visiting, but because of what they had decided this moment would mean. Traore approached him with a quiet smile. He was dressed simply again, in a loose tunic the color of earth and sandals worn from use. He gestured toward the platform. No speeches, he said, just hearts. Stallone nodded. Then Traore stepped onto the makeshift stage, his posture tall, his voice clear without a microphone. The children looked up at him not like he was a president, but like he was theirs. He gestured toward Stallone, who remained standing just behind the seated children. Many years ago, Traore began, I was one of them. I sat on this ground, in this dust, watching a man fight on a flickering screen. I did not understand his words, but I understood his struggle. The crowd was silent, still. That man taught me how to stand, he said. He taught me to fight, not with violence, but with hope. He taught me that getting back up, even when the world counts you out, is the most powerful act of resistance. Traore turned toward Stallone. And today he's here, not as an actor, not as a star, but as something greater. He paused. The silence deepened. He taught us to fight through a screen. Today, he teaches us to believe, face to face. There was no applause, no eruption, just a wave of something deeper. Respect, recognition, the kind of stillness that lingers in churches and between the pages of old sacred books. Stallone stepped forward slowly, each footstep pressing into the red earth like a signature. He climbed onto the wooden platform, his hands slightly trembling. He stood there for a moment, looking out at the circle of children, the makeshift school buildings, the old tree leaning in like a curious elder. He didn't have a speech prepared, so he spoke from somewhere deeper. "I've spent my whole life playing fighters," he said. "Men who get knocked down, bloodied, bruised, but stand up again. And I always thought that was strength." He looked down at the bracelet still on his wrist. It glinted in the sunlight, small but bright. "But being here, watching you all, hearing your stories," his voice caught, but he let the silence speak for him. "I realize now, real strength is waking up every morning in a world that forgets you, and still choosing to believe that you matter." He looked directly at one little boy sitting cross-legged near the front. "I didn't come here to teach. I came to learn. From you." A girl raised a small sign drawn on cardboard, a heart with wings and the word merci. Stallone smiled through wet eyes. "I don't know what I can give you," he said, "but I know this. I believe in you. Every single one of you. And sometimes, that's the start of everything." Traore stepped beside him, his hand resting briefly on Stallone's shoulder, grounding the moment with a simple, wordless gesture. And then the children stood, not to perform, not to impress, but to sing. A soft, imperfect chorus rose, untrained and beautiful. Their voices blended in a language not everyone understood, but the emotion translated perfectly. It was a song about hope, about standing, about light breaking through dust. Stallone stood still, letting the music wash over him, and in that moment, surrounded by children under the wide African sky, he no longer felt like a man remembering his legacy. He felt like someone just beginning it. As the final notes of the children's song faded into the afternoon breeze, Traore stepped away from the circle. He walked with quiet purpose toward a small table shaded beneath a tree at the edge of the schoolyard. On it sat a plain wooden box, no larger than a shoebox, carved with simple patterns. Stars, waves, and at the center, an open eye. It had the weathered look of something passed hand to hand, generation to generation, more sacred than polished. Stallone followed without a word. His footsteps were slower now, heavy not with exhaustion but with something deeper. Anticipation, curiosity, reverence. When he reached the table, Traore motioned gently to the box. "This," the president said, "is not a gift. It's a blueprint." Stallone looked at him, puzzled, then slowly lifted the lid. Inside, carefully folded and tied with string, were several sheets of hand-drawn plans. The paper was thick, creased at the corners, covered in pencil lines and faded ink. He unrolled the first sheet and froze. It was a building, as not large, not grand, but full of life. There were small classrooms drawn in careful lines, a wide-open courtyard in the center, and one long, low building labeled simply, "Recording Room." Notes in the margins were scribbled in French and English. Light from both sides, space for stories, projector made from solar panel. At the bottom in bold hand was a title, "L'Académie du Conte," the Storytelling Academy. Stallone looked up, his voice cracking. "This is," Traore nodded, "a place for them, to tell their stories, to believe their voices matter, to know that they can be more than what the world told them." He paused, then added with a quiet smile, "It won't be fancy, but it will be ours." Stallone kept turning the pages, each one revealing more. A modest library, an outdoor stage with logs for seating, a mural wall where children could paint their heroes. There was even a room titled Silence Room, with just one note beneath, "For healing before words come." He couldn't speak for a moment. The bracelet on his wrist pressed against his skin, grounding him. Then finally he looked up. "We'll build it," Stallone said. His voice wasn't loud, but it rang with clarity. Not just in name, not just with good intentions. I'll bring cameras, sound, teachers, real investment, and I'll be back. Again and again if I have to. Whatever it takes. He placed a hand on the plans, as if signing them not with ink, but with conviction. Together, he said. Let's build it. Together. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The wind caught the edge of the plans, fluttering the top sheet like it wanted to lift off. The world seemed to pause around them, not to admire, but to witness. Traore smiled, the corners of his eyes creasing with gratitude, but also something deeper, relief. He had not just extended hope, he had seen it answered. This is not about you, Sylvester, he said, and it's not about me. It's about the children, the quiet ones, the brave ones, the ones who still believe stories can save lives. Stallone nodded. I know, he said. That's why I'm here. And as they stood over the hand-drawn dreams of a dusty academy in the heart of Africa, two men, one who had made a career out of storytelling and one who had lived a story no film could capture, found themselves not at the end of a journey, but at the beginning of something far greater. Not fiction, not fantasy, but legacy. The road back into the old neighborhood of Ouagadougou was narrow and unpaved, lined with low, crumbling walls and shadows cast by flickering lanterns inside homes made of clay and tin. The convoy had disappeared. No security detail, no cameras. Just a small pickup with two men in the back seat, a president and a movie star, sitting in silence as the truck bounced over potholes and patches of dried earth. When the vehicle finally came to a stop, Traore stepped out first and Stallone followed. Before them stood a modest, time-worn house. Single level, its paint long faded by heat and storms. There was no gate, only a crooked wooden door and two narrow windows draped with fabric. But to Stallone, it looked like the heart of something far bigger than any mansion. This is it, Traore said, with a smile tinged in memory. My mother raised us here. She used to sit on that stool over there and pray for rain. They sat together on a pair of mismatched wooden chairs beneath the open night sky. The air was warm, but still. The stars above stretched wide and glittering, unpolluted by city lights, pressing low like they were listening in. A woman, a cousin, or perhaps a neighbor, brought them plates of rice and grilled chicken. No garnish, no sauces, just salt, smoke, and care. They ate with their hands, pausing between bites to swat away a lazy moth drawn by the porch light. For a long while they didn't speak. The silence was easy, honest. Then Traore leaned back, looking up at the stars. You know, he said, people think presidents and actors live different lives. But I think we're just boys, trying to protect what we love. Stallone looked at him, then down at his plate, nodding slowly. He chewed in thought. The phrase sat in the air like something written into the sky. He smiled, a slow, tired smile that came from deep within. This feels like a movie I never got to make. Maybe you weren't supposed to make it, Traore replied. Maybe you were supposed to live it. They sat back in their chairs, eyes fixed on the sky. Somewhere in the distance, a baby cried. Somewhere closer, someone sang, off-key but gently, like a lullaby passed through generations. Stallone took a long breath, the kind that filled not just lungs but soul. You know, I've been in movies where the world ends, where heroes save cities, where the music swells and everyone claps. He turned to Traore. But this is the quietest thing I've ever felt, and somehow, the loudest. Traore raised his cup. Just water, but it felt like wine. To stories, he said, that begin where scripts usually end. Stallone clinked his cup against it, quietly, and under that wide Burkina Faso sky, the two men sat like old friends who had never met before this week. Not as a president and an icon, but simply as two boys, grown now, still trying in their own ways to hold together the pieces of a world that so often forgets its own children. The stars above them blinked, distant, eternal, as if nodding in agreement. Los Angeles was quiet that night, unusually so. The hills glowed with a soft haze of streetlights, and far below, the city murmured with distant life. Horns, footsteps, the occasional barking dog. But inside a modest home tucked in the canyons, Sylvester Stallone sat alone on his couch, the windows wide open, letting in the warm air of a summer evening. He had returned from Burkina Faso just hours before. There had been no press, no handlers waiting, no welcome banners, just the kind of silence that only follows something deeply personal. The wooden box had traveled in his lap for the entire flight. Small, light, and wrapped in hand-stitched fabric, it now sat on the coffee table in front of him, still unopened. He stared at it like it might speak first. A part of him didn't want to lift the lid. He was afraid, not of what he might find, but of how much it would make him feel. He wasn't ready to close the door on that part of the world just yet. But eventually, with the night deepening around him, he reached forward and undid the cloth. The box gave a soft creak as it opened. Inside lay three simple things. First, a flag, the national flag of Burkina Faso, carefully folded, its red and green fabric edged with the smallest stitches. Across it, signatures in different colors looped and overlapped. Children's names, tiny hearts, stars, and scrawled messages in French and English. Some were barely readable, others just drawings. Hands, eyes, wings. He unfolded it slowly and ran his fingers across the names, his throat tightening as he imagined each small hand that had touched the cloth. Then tucked just beneath the flag was a golden pin. It was small and smooth, shaped like a lion standing before a rising sun, a symbol he recognized now. It was the emblem of national honor, reserved for those who had shown bravery in the face of darkness. His hand trembled as he held it, and then, at the bottom, a folded note. The paper was thick, the ink pressed deep as if each word had been written with care, not just speed. It read, "You came as a stranger. You left as family. This is not a goodbye. This is a beginning." There was no signature. It didn't need one. Stallone leaned back, note in hand, the flag spread over his knees. He looked out through the window at the stars, the same stars he had seen from a dusty backyard in Ouagadougou just nights ago. But something had changed. They didn't seem so distant anymore. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, almost in a whisper, to no one at all, he murmured, "I thought I went to give something, but I think they gave me everything." He stood slowly, walked out onto the balcony, and looked up at the night sky. In one hand, he still held the lion pin. In the other, the note. He didn't cry this time. Instead, he smiled. Soft, broken, full of something new. Not sadness, not pride, belonging. The jet soared high above the Atlantic, its engines humming softly through the hushed interior of the cabin. Stallone sat by the window, still wrapped in silence. The flag of Burkina Faso folded neatly on the seat beside him. Outside, stars shimmered against the dark canvas of sky, but his eyes weren't focused on them. They were fixed on something far deeper, far more urgent. The box was open on his lap, the golden lion pin resting in his palm like a weight he couldn't put down. His fingers traced its edge absent-mindedly, but his thoughts were racing. Something gnawed at him. A pull, a voice he couldn't ignore. He kept hearing the children's laughter, the president's voice, the quiet promise he'd made beneath the baobab tree. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and then sat up straight. He reached for the intercom and pressed the button. A flight attendant appeared moments later, her steps cautious, expecting a typical request. "I need to speak to the captain," Stallone said, calmly but firmly. "Is everything all right, sir?" "No," he said. "I left too soon." Minutes later, the pilot appeared at the cabin door, puzzled. "Yes, Mr. Stallone?" "Can we turn this plane around?" Stallone asked, eyes steady. I wasn't finished." There was a pause, not one of hesitation but of surprise. "You want to go back to Burkina Faso?" "Yes," he said. "There's something I need to finish. No press, no announcement, just me." The pilot looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "We'll contact clearance immediately." As the jet began to alter course, Stallone returned to his seat, this time with purpose in his spine. He wasn't returning for ceremony or spotlight. He wasn't returning for anyone's approval. He was returning because something had been planted in his soul, and it hadn't finished growing. No script, no stage, just a man returning to the place where something real had begun. And as the stars shifted outside the window, so did he. The plane touched down without ceremony in the early hours of the morning. No red carpet, no waiting convoy. Just the soft echo of tires kissing tarmac and the quiet breath of earth welcoming someone home. Word traveled fast in Ouagadougou, even without headlines. And when Stallone stepped once more onto Burkinabe soil, President Ibrahim Traore was already waiting near the edge of the airstrip, standing in the same sandals and tunic as before, a calm smile stretching across his face. He didn't speak at first, just nodded, like a man greeting the return of something inevitable. Then gently, "I knew you'd return." Stallone approached him, eyes clear, steps grounded with the certainty of someone who had made the right decision. He didn't waste time with apologies or explanations. "I want to help build it," he said, voice steady. "Not with promises, with action, with cameras, sound, light, real teachers, real tools, filmmakers who believe in story, not profit. Let's teach these kids to tell the world who they are, in their own words." Traore's smile widened, not with surprise, but with quiet pride. "You don't owe us this." Stallone shook his head. "I owe it to myself, to them." The two men stood in silence for a moment longer, the early light just beginning to stretch across the land behind them. Then Traore opened his arms, and Stallone stepped forward into an embrace. Not of formality, but of kinship. Two men once strangers from opposite corners of the world, now united by something deeper than background or fame. Faith in the power of stories, and the children who still dared to write them. The courtyard was simple. No stage lights, no polished floors. Just cracked earth beneath small feet and wide-eyed children circling around. But across the globe, the cameras rolled. A local live stream had gone viral. Reporters from afar tuned in. For once, the world wasn't watching for gossip. It was watching for hope. Stallone stood beneath the baobab tree again, holding a child's drawing, a boxer with angel wings. He raised it above his head and let the world see. "I once thought I was the fighter," he said, his voice clear and trembling. "But you, all of you fight harder, against hunger, against fear, against being forgotten." Traore stood nearby, quiet, hands clasped in front of him. This wasn't about politics. It was about something bigger. A moment of truth made visible. The children began to clap, slowly, rhythmically. Not for a man, but for a belief that their stories mattered. As the sun dipped low, dust rose into golden light, and Stallone knelt to eye level with a group of kids who now saw him not as Rocky, but as family. Back in Los Angeles, days after the ceremony, Stallone sat alone with the letter that had changed everything. He took a photo, then another. Then he posted it. Not to boast, but to share what had cracked him open. "This letter found me when I forgot what stories can do," he wrote. "Today I remember. This is not charity, it's solidarity." The internet erupted. 300 million views in 48 hours. Comments in French, Swahili, Portuguese, Tagalog, Arabic. Veterans, orphans, teachers, actors, all said the same thing. "Thank you for reminding us what matters." UNICEF responded, pledging support for the Storytelling Academy. Young African filmmakers posted open letters. "You didn't speak for us. You listened to us. That's power." A wave of compassion swept across timelines usually filled with division. For once, the algorithm served hope. And Stallone? He read every message he could, sometimes with tears, sometimes with laughter. And one quiet night he whispered, "This is the kind of script no one in Hollywood could write." The sun was setting over the dusty courtyard as children ran barefoot through the warm light, their laughter rising into the evening air. Sylvester Stallone stood among them. No cameras, no spotlight. Just smiles, joy, and the sound of life. One child reached up and hugged his waist. Another grabbed his hand and didn't let go. He lifted a little girl into his arms, and she laughed without fear. Around them, the others danced, played, and sang with pure freedom. Stallone looked at the wooden bracelet still wrapped around his wrist and smiled. For the first time in a long time, he felt no pressure to perform, No urge to prove anything. Just peace. He looked out at the children, his voice soft in the breeze. All my life, I thought I needed applause. But what I really needed was this. He wasn't a hero on a screen anymore. He was home. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the scene faded into gold. And Stallone stood in the middle of it all, laughing, surrounded by the very thing he'd been searching for all along. Belonging. Sometimes the greatest stories don't happen on a movie screen. They unfold in dusty villages, handwritten letters, and the quiet strength of children who dream beyond their circumstances. Stallone's journey reminds us that fame fades, but kindness echoes. It's not about being a hero in the spotlight, but showing up when no one's watching. What began as a fan letter became a bridge between worlds, a reminder that stories heal, unite, and awaken purpose. What would you do if one child's letter changed everything you thought you knew about yourself? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.